All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Oncology Advisors podcast, our monthly podcast on our AI technology theme. Today, we're joined by one of our guests today, Dr. Tamir Wolf, who's the head of theater, who we'll be talking about a little bit today. Thanks so much for joining today, Dr. Wolf.
My pleasure.
So I know you've had a really interesting background before, being at theater. You've done a lot of work in healthcare entrepreneurship. You're a SEAL. You did an MD, PhD, a lot of cool things. Just tell me a little bit about your pathway, sort of before coming to the company and how it was founded.
All right, cool. So again, thanks for having me. Always delighted to talk about things that are interesting to the clinicians out there, especially those that are interested in embedding themselves also in technology. So my path, I've always been an outlier. Did MD PhD, was one of the first in my class to do that. I went to med school as an ROTC. And so ultimately found myself in the Navy, where I spent some time, quite a bit of time there, originally in Israel, and then needed a break afterwards and found myself in tech. So left clinical practice, did some MBAing in Boston, and then decided that I want to have impact not at an individual level, but back of the envelope calculation, wanted to have impact on a broader scale, which is what led me to think about, all right, where's an unmet need and what can we do to tackle it? And ultimately found myself at theater after realizing that there's significant variability in surgical care specifically, in healthcare in general, but in surgical care in particular, just because of the siloed nature of residency and fellowship, and then just practice. And so dove all in.
Yeah, I was reading online that you had some different sort of people close to you who you recommended different hospitals for a procedure, and then it sounds like they had completely different outcomes.
Yeah, and even when you take a look within departments, you see tremendous variability just in how surgery is performed. And I think for hundreds of years, folks have been talking about surgery as a art. But I
Right.
think there's a lot that we need to do. I think it's science, honestly. There's an art form to it, but I think that we really need to do a much better job at standardizing,
Mhm.
especially like the key elements. And so at theater, what we're really doing is trying to unearth and surface what is actually going on in the operating room, and then ultimately codify surgery
Mhm.
and scale access to high quality, low cost care.
Got it. So you've had this really cool background in healthcare entrepreneurship, different kinds of settings. Sort of got involved in theater. So how do you try to integrate AI to improve surgical outcomes? What kind of things are you looking at, and what's an example you can talk about showing the success so far?
So when we started out, my idea was that we need to help guide surgeons in real time.
Mhm.
What I realized very quickly is that in surgery, I think very different from other domains in healthcare, there is very little consensus on what best practices even look like. And so in order to guide folks on what to do, we first need to understand what good looks like. And then it became really apparent that the OR is pretty much the last silo of like lack of transparency. You've got cameras everywhere, all over the hospital. You've got data coming out of everywhere. But then like the OR is this silo where for a very long time, what happens there stays there. And so the foundational layer for everything that we're doing is number one, just capturing information and data. When you think about data from the operating room, you can break it down into like two big buckets. One bucket is, slapping on a couple of cameras in the room and taking a look at team dynamics and turnover, et cetera. The other bucket is really analyzing operative performance. We went down the second route. It's very easy to put a couple of cameras in the room, technologically speaking. It's very difficult culturally
Yeah.
to ensure that they like folks don't disconnect them from the wall.
Yeah.
Whereas when we're talking about intracorporeal surgical footage, you know, a lot of surgical procedures are done minimally invasively, whether laparoscopic, for example, or robotic. And so the visual guidance is already there. And so what we do is we routinely capture intracorporeal performance in order to basically start building an entire universe around that.
Mhm.
Um, and even this is a heavy lift within the world of surgery, because up until now, no one's ever done it. But we believe that what happens in the OR matters, and so we enable routine capture of intracorporeal surgical footage, and we then connect it to the patient and to outcomes in order to understand, what happens in the OR and then how it impacts outcomes, which I think is important and like we're doing for the first time. So I'll give you just one example. Critical view of safety is something that general surgeons have been talking about for 20 years in lap cholecystectomy and gallbladder surgery, ever since they, invented the approach, and yet no one's really been able to identify whether or not this is a best practice that's actually adopted in routine real world care. And so we have the capabilities to leverage algorithms in a very scalable way to identify in each and every single procedure, thousands on a weekly basis, whether or not this specific element, which has been shown to lead to better outcomes, is being incorporated into the procedure. And, this is, an example of, for the first time incorporating into like real world workflow, the ability to identify whether best practices are being adopted on our way towards real-time decision support, which is, just like autonomous vehicles, I think still a bit away. But this is how we start understanding whether best practices are adopted or not. And we're actually able to demonstrate in departments that there's a cultural buy-in. We're able to demonstrate an improvement in adoption of this and other best practices over time. Reduce operative time, which is extremely important, especially in today's environment. So there's a lot of value from an operational perspective, obviously clinical and for the patient, also impacting the finances, which is extremely important to talk about as well. But the other thing that I would mention is that the video is really the ground truth of what happens in the operating room. You can leverage that to do a variety of things, including everything that I talked about, from quality improvement, patient safety, really avoiding never events, the operational aspects. But you can also leverage video in order to improve the way things are being done. So for example, automation of the operative report is something that we're right now working on, or ensuring billing integrity is a proof of concept that we're just now working on. And so there are a variety of elements, both surgeon facing, departmental facing, and also healthcare institution facing, that are all based on this notion of routinely capturing procedures that are being done and leveraging the information for a variety of unmet needs.
Wow, that's so amazing. And I think really talking on sort of about the art versus science of the surgical OR is really, really interesting. I think for medical oncology, you have this option, just randomize patients to different arms, look at, overall survival, be able to get this data, compare baseline characteristics. But in the OR, there's, hundreds and thousands of variables that sometimes you're looking at. I was in medical school, and I'd be interested to see if nice versus intensive surgical attendings have different outcomes for patients. But that's really cool. I'm also curious to hear how Theater's platform could be used to improve graduate medical education, like for residents or surgical trainees.
Oh, so we're working very closely with a few departments at Mayo Clinic. We have residents and fellows that just live on the platform. The ability to take a look at a procedure and then asynchronously interact with one another, provide feedback, receive feedback. There are numerous ways from that perspective. But I think, the Gen Z and future generations of surgeons are all going to be extremely tech savvy, just like everything in life. We're consuming video as a key form of information. And so, very, very similar, being able to live on these procedures, interact with one another. You don't need to be in the same room. You could just do it asynchronously is something that we've seen is extremely powerful. Theater is being incorporated into the weekly journal clubs, that residents and fellows have, and a lot of other things. But the ability to within a second, get to a specific moment in time in a video that is automatically identified for you, and you don't need to run through hours and hours of footage, but steps, events, key milestones in a procedure are all automatically identified. The ability to jump to that and interact on a specific moment in time, facilitates for something that's a lot more user-friendly, easy to do. And so residents and fellows love the platform.
That's awesome to hear. Now, just shifting gears sort of from Theater's platform, just a little bit about yourself and sort of your entrepreneurial background. You've spoken before about the importance of company culture driving success. What are some of the key ingredients that are kind of needed to be successful in the AI healthcare startup space?
So I think timing is important. Like that's something that you can't really control. But today there's, a lot of willingness to accept, these types of technology from healthcare systems. I think that's extremely important. Selling to healthcare systems is not easy. So I think it's something that can be extremely helpful. The ingredients from a company perspective, I think it's a good combination of like clinical domain expertise and the technical know-how. There are a lot of really interesting technological solutions, but how do they really answer an unmet need that is true and real? That's only something that you can figure out if you have like the right individuals that can ask the questions. And so I think that combination has been something that's like really powerful for us, because the way we're looking at it, we're building a variety of solutions that can incorporate within existing workflows. So it's not like a huge cultural paradigm shift,
Right.
even though it's like cutting edge. And so the ability to do that relies on like having those two components.
Mhm. Okay. And then just to kind of build upon, you sort of mentioned domain expertise. So with all the change going on in the world of AI and medicine, all the daily updates, all the new trials, all the new studies, what's your information diet? Like, how do you keep up with new stuff and new findings in the literature and press?
Well, it's, I think from a technical perspective, it's very like there are specific areas that you go to and resources that you go to, but honestly, we're the ones that are creating a huge delta like in our domain. And I think the like more important than this algorithm or that algorithm is really understanding like the basic issues and the problems that you're trying to solve. Because again, technology is cool, but if it's not like providing value, it's meaningless. And so I think being embedded within the healthcare system and understanding the exact pain points of like a surgeon or clinical leadership or administration as it comes to surgery, ultimately, serving patients, I think that is like the real important element. And then like everything else is just on top of that.
Right. Okay. And then just to add on to that, how do you recommend oncologists or clinicians who are in practice, like how should they learn about AI? How can they kind of incorporate it into their practice? What are some tips you would have for those people?
So I think AI is a buzzword.
Right.
Again, and so the way I would look at it is really think about like what are the issues that we as physicians or oncologists like encounter on a daily basis? Like what are the problems? Where's an unmet need that we identify? And then from there, try to look for solutions that can actually, help us like from that perspective. So whether it's like in the diagnosis of elements or whether it's in like a workflow that we want to enhance and improve. I think AI, again, buzzword, but can do a lot for us. Like, for example, it really is an enabler of automation and doing things at scale.
Mhm.
But I think coming from the angle of, all right, like what is the problem that I'm trying to solve? And are there solutions for it? And if not, all right, let's start diving into that rabbit hole and figure out like if we can come up with a solution. I think that's the best way. That's the best way to approach something like this. So it's not so much a hammer looking for a nail, but it's the other way around.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And just final question, can you just talk about any recent partnerships or emerging developments at theater?
Well, we're working, like I mentioned earlier, we're working very closely with Mayo Clinic, University of Miami, and other institutions. A lot of the things that we're working on right now is, again, like continuously expanding on the offering of analysis of routine video capture, which is, again, the ground truth. So we not only capture the intraoperative video, but we also connect the dots with the medical record with the idea that the magic that happens is really when you marry intraoperative performance and postoperative outcomes. But like I mentioned before, there are multiple areas where we're now diving a lot deeper into. For example, like imagine a world where you don't need to write an operative report, but it's all automatically generated for you. It's going to be a lot more accurate, introduce a lot less bias. If it's a cookie cutter template, which is most often like the way things are being done today, it like completely revamps and changes the way things are done. And so right now we're working with a select group of partners to actually push this like paradigm shift in the world of surgery. I think very similar to like a lot of the things that you hear outside the OR from like an ambient perspective, but I think video is the ground truth, as I mentioned several times on this call, that allows us to really generate things in a very, very different way.
Thanks for sharing, Dr. Wolf. Thanks for everyone joining our podcast today. I think this is a really cool example of sort of someone using their medical expertise and sort of noticing things in the real world, just trying to drive a structural change in healthcare. So all the best with the company, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.